When you go through the history books, there are certain key battles and events that'll immediately be familiar. And when it comes to World War II, this is very definitely the case. Despite the thousands of military engagements between 1939 and 45, all worthy of note, there are certain dates forever emblazoned on the public consciousness. From the Battle of Britain to Pearl Harbor, El Alamein to D-Day, there are many to choose from. But if it's overcoming impossible odds in the face of overwhelming adversity you're looking for, then the subject of this programme, the beaches of Dunkirk, has to be the most fascinating of them all. Geographically speaking, Dunkirk is a port on the northern coast of France, and if it were not for the dramatic events that occurred here during the Second World War, it would simply be a delightful coastal town. It might not be an obvious choice as a holiday destination, despite its ferry connection with Dover, but nonetheless, Dunkirk does have a fascinating history that's tinged with more than its fair share of irony. The first mention in the history books of Dunkirk appears in 1067, the name having derived from the Dutch for the Church of the Dune, and it's actually been a much disputed territory down through the ages. Spain, the Netherlands, France and the British all had control of the area at different points in time, long before Hitler's German stormtroopers so famously took up their occupation in 1940. Interestingly, it was considered part of Britain for a while after Oliver Cromwell's victory over the Spanish. But when King Charles II was restored to the British throne in the 17th century, he sold Dunkirk to the French for £320,000, almost the same figure as the number of Allied troops that would be miraculously rescued from the Germans here so many years later. The now famous evacuations from the beaches of Dunkirk between May the 26th and June the 4th, 1940, when 331,226 Allied soldiers were saved from inevitable annihilation, are of course what really has put Dunkirk on history's map. The dedication and sheer hard work that went into rescuing the Allied troops from these beaches in the early summer of 1940 has become a part of British heritage, and what's now referred to as the Dunkirk spirit sums up the never-say-die attitude that even in defeat nevertheless won the day. Throughout Operation Dynamo, as the rescue was codenamed, the unity that was shown by military personnel and British civilians alike is legendary, as was the leadership of the newly appointed Prime Minister, Winston Churchill. But we're racing rather ahead of ourselves, and before we get to what happened on the beaches of Dunkirk, the fact that Winston Churchill happened to be in a position to order the rescue mission is indeed another miracle, and absolutely crucial to the events that unfolded in northern France while World War II was just beginning. Ironically, as a prospective nemesis for Adolf Hitler, as every military decision the German Führer took in 1940 seemed to bring him greater success, Winston Churchill was, on paper at least, far from being an obvious candidate. Just like Hitler, Churchill had been involved with the First World War. Winston had been First Lord of the Admiralty, but having been made the scapegoat for the disastrous Gallipoli campaign, he was stripped of the office. While Hitler fought as a soldier in the trenches, becoming incensed at what he perceived as betrayal by the surrender of the German government, Churchill found himself fighting for his political career. As the world struggled to rebuild itself after the armistice of 1918, Hitler battled his way to power in Germany, and Churchill faced a long road ahead of him to rebuild his reputation. Nevertheless, Winston Churchill was never one for political tact and diplomacy, and although he returned to the centre stage at the House of Commons, comments like those advocating the use of machine guns on the striking miners in 1926 did not help his cause. He also expressed admiration for Mussolini. And when Edward VIII chose to abdicate in order to marry the American divorcee Wallis Simpson late in 1936, Churchill supported the departing king, who was, in some circles, viewed as a Nazi sympathiser. Now, although Churchill's judgment could have undoubtedly been considered controversial, during this time he was loudly voicing his concerns over Adolf Hitler's rise to power in Germany, warning that there would be dire consequences for failing to take action, not just for Great Britain, but for the entire world. However, when Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin retired in 1937, after seeing through the political storm of the abdication, Winston Churchill was unfortunately considered far too outspoken to succeed him. Consequently, Neville Chamberlain was appointed Prime Minister, an honour that would prove to be something of a poisoned chalice for the mild-mannered Chamberlain, as far as the history books would be concerned. Almost immediately, Chamberlain was forced to face the threat that Churchill had been warning about, as Adolf Hitler began his advance through Europe. Matters came to a head when, after annexing neighbouring Austria, Hitler turned his attention to Czechoslovakia, and Chamberlain, who fiercely opposed going to war, settled upon a policy of appeasement, much to Churchill's horror. Even when Chamberlain met with Hitler in 1938, returning with a resolution signed by the Führer agreeing to cease his empire building, Churchill refused to believe that this would be the end of the crises. And how right he turned out to be when Chamberlain's claim of peace for our time proved not to be worth the paper it was written on. Hitler's troops quickly marched into Czechoslovakia's capital, Prague, and when they stormed into Poland on the 1st of September 1939, Chamberlain finally had to accept that war with Germany was inevitable. Yet, in his favour, he at least had the good sense to call Winston Churchill back to take command as First Lord of the Admiralty. So it was that on the 3rd of September 1939, the day that Chamberlain declared war on Germany, Churchill returned to the Admiralty. It said that the British Navy sent out a signal to all its ships, simply saying, "Winston is back." Churchill may have been a thorn in Chamberlain's side, but the people of Britain were glad of his reassuring presence, and the man best placed to halt Adolf Hitler in his tracks on the beaches of Dunkirk was already manoeuvring himself into position. Despite the flurry of activity as war was declared, very little happened through the latter stages of 1939. And for the people of Britain, this period came to be known as the Phony War. Nevertheless, Churchill continued to advocate taking action against Hitler, while Chamberlain and the government maintained something of a wait-and-see approach. In stark contrast, Hitler was busy consolidating his position, working around the clock to tighten his stranglehold on Europe and make his vision of a new world order a terrifying reality. as soon as one country had fallen, he immediately pushed his men onto the next, and it truly did seem that Hitler was unstoppable. And what's more, he gave notice of precisely what his intentions were in a directive issued early in 1940. An offensive will be planned through Luxembourg, Belgium and Holland, and must be launched at the earliest possible moment. The purpose of this offensive will be to defeat as much as possible of the French army and of the forces of the Allies fighting on their side, and at the same time to win as much territory as possible in Holland, Belgium and northern France to serve as a base for the successful prosecution of the air and sea war against England. Hitler had no intention of losing the advantage that all the years of appeasement had given him, and there was little doubt that the Low Countries, France and the United Kingdom, were all now in the greatest danger. Again, Churchill urged Chamberlain and the government to go on the attack when he recognised Hitler's intentions were now being directed to the north and Scandinavia. Churchill wanted to send British troops to protect Norway, from where Hitler obtained precious raw materials for Germany's industrial heartland. But Winston's wise words went unheeded. Before anyone could do anything to stop him, Hitler stormed into Denmark, where the surrender was immediate, and then invaded Norway. The Norwegians fought fiercely for their independence, but the struggle was futile, as Hitler continued to crush all resistance. Now the Führer could focus on the next stage of his directive, confident that his blitzkrieg tactics were proving unbeatable. That Neville Chamberlain had had his day was now evident, and after the fall of Norway, he was told in no uncertain terms during a debate in the House of Commons that his services were no longer required, when the words of that most famous of parliamentarians, Oliver Cromwell, were quoted to him. "You have sat too long here for any good you have been doing. Depart, I say, and let us have done with you." Chamberlain, although having been proved so very wrong in his assessment of Adolf Hitler, was nevertheless a man of honour and resigned. Ironically, his health was already failing, and he died of cancer just 6 months later, but the question of who his successor should be was of the utmost importance. With the threat of Hitler invading Britain alarmingly imminent, this was no time for the tit-for-tat disputes of party politics. Consequently, a coalition government was formed, and there was only one man considered to have the wherewithal to lead the nation against such an attack, and on the 10th of May 1940, Winston Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty, became Prime Minister. Churchill was well aware that a great deal of time had been wasted during the months of the phony war, and he was eager to break the deadlock as soon as possible, mobilising Allied forces against Hitler. However, Churchill was not given the luxury of even sufficient breathing space to gather his thoughts, let alone a government, because on the day that Britain's coalition government was announced, the Nazis invaded both Holland and Belgium. This was, of course, no great surprise to the Allied nations, as everyone was well aware that Hitler was planning to take control of the whole of Europe. But what was shocking was just how quickly he was doing it. Interestingly, this provocative action had been planned in order to entice the Allies into coming to the aid of Belgium, which may sound a little strange. Now, Hitler was not in the habit at this early stage in the war of making huge tactical errors, and his shrewd ploy heralded one of the Nazis' most brilliant operations in their quest for a new world order. In fact, it was the German army's invasion of Belgium that would in turn trigger a series of events that would leave so many soldiers in need of rescue on the beaches of Dunkirk. The attack plan, which the Germans called Sickle Stroke, was an extremely elaborate operation that could have easily crushed the Allied troops. Hitler was so certain that the next few months would be his most successful that the very evening before the attack, he had this to say to his staff: "Gentlemen, you are about to witness the most famous victory in history." And to give credit where it's due, if it had not been for the audacity of the British under the leadership of Winston Churchill, he might well have been right. Hitler's plan of action had been extremely well thought out, using 3 divisions that were known as Groups A, B and C. It was Group B that was responsible for invading Belgium and Holland, in the hope of drawing as many Allied troops as possible northwards. Group C had the task of attacking France along the defensive Maginot Line, again keeping Allied troops fully engaged. And while all this was occurring, Group A would have a clear path to advance through the forest of the Ardennes to the south of the Allied forces, in effect trapping them in the north, which is precisely what happened. With every detail meticulously attended to, the Nazi attack started blisteringly early, at 4:30 on the 10th of May 1940. To neutralise the air threat from the Allies, the Luftwaffe went in first and bombed Dutch, Belgium and French air bases, and as soon as they'd achieved their objective, the ground forces crossed the border into Belgium and Holland. Due to the superior tactics of the Nazis, after only a few days of fighting, the Dutch knew that they were powerless to stop the relentless attack, and on the 15th of May they had no choice but to surrender. Back in Britain, as the news got steadily worse, Churchill was keeping a watchful eye on what was happening in Europe. Of extreme concern was the welfare of the British Expeditionary Force, better known as the BEF, who'd been providing reinforcements wherever possible, as Hitler's troops advanced across the continent since war had been declared. The BEF had actually been long established, created by the then Secretary of State for War, Richard Haldane, following the Second Boer War at the end of the 19th century. BEF divisions were always kept on standby in case British troops had to be deployed overseas to fight again at short notice, and there'd never been a greater demand for their services. But matters were much worse than Churchill knew, as while the BEF were busy fighting with their Belgian and French compatriots in the north, the Germans' Army Group A, complete with an 1,800-strong Panzer tank division, were edging through the Ardennes forest without anyone even paying them the slightest heed. The Ardennes forest was virtually undefended, and gave the Nazis an almost trouble-free run towards northern France. This window of opportunity arose for the Germans because while the French were arranging their defences, they concluded that any army of consequence would not make it through the density of the Ardennes forest. But this didn't take into account the strength of Hitler's panzer divisions. These screeching tanks had been at the heart of Hitler's blitzkrieg from the very start. And just as the tanks had previously crushed so much of Europe, they now sped through the Ardennes forest as part of Hitler's inspired plan to trap the Allies in a pincer movement. Before anyone realised it, or could do anything about it, the Germans had totally cut off the French and British troops. And with the Allies completely trapped, there was no other option but to move further towards the coast. This allowed great waves of German troops to cross the French-Belgian border and into France, with dreadful consequences for the Allied servicemen and the French civilian population, now under siege. Within just a matter of days, the Allies were completely surrounded on three sides, and try as they might, they just couldn't break through the strength of the German lines. Events were getting extremely serious for the BEF, and Churchill knew that the mission was no longer about how to get reinforcements across to defend mainland Europe, because it was now about how to get those that were there back out alive. As each hour passed, the news was becoming increasingly grave, as the Germans continued to increase their stranglehold on the Allies, pushing them further towards the beaches of Dunkirk. Churchill and his government were by this moment in time in little doubt that a disaster was imminent, and nothing short of a miracle would save the BEF. Without further delay, the call for a full retreat went out to all the Allied troops in Europe, and they were instructed to make their way immediately to the coastline. With the ground forces now heading en masse for Dunkirk, the Allied leaders had to face the seemingly impossible task of trying to find a way to transport as many men as possible away from the French beaches before the Germans got to them. This was no easy task, for they would then have to ensure a secure passage across the English Channel and get the men to the safety of British soil as quickly as possible before the enemy intercepted them. This daunting task was made even more problematic due to the fact that the Luftwaffe were also patrolling the skies above Dunkirk, ready to destroy any ships attempting a rescue mission by sea from Britain. Time was of the essence, particularly as losing such a vast number of military personnel would severely dent the Allied war effort in the months and years to come. With Hitler's star so firmly in the ascendancy, the battles ahead were going to be tough enough, without the early casualties of war being on such a huge scale. An epic disaster was brewing, but Winston Churchill and the British Navy had to face a most uncomfortable realisation. The harsh truth was that there simply weren't enough vessels to rescue the soldiers now gathering daily at Dunkirk. On paper, when all the calculations had been done, the most any rescue mission could hope to achieve would be 45,000 men. The Admiralty had nothing more to offer, and while conditions at Dunkirk deteriorated, as more and more men attempted to find shelter where there was none, it looked as if for the majority of them, this was quite literally going to be the end of the line. However, there was just the faintest glimmer of hope. Back on the 14th of May, a message had been broadcast to the nation after the 9 o'clock news, requesting that all owners of seaworthy craft that hadn't already been requisitioned for the war effort register them with the Admiralty. The response was phenomenal, as people offered everything from yachts to pleasure cruisers, and in effect, the British Navy now had a huge civilian fleet on standby. Meanwhile, Winston Churchill and the government wasted no time in getting their plans for a rescue mission set in motion. Even though at this point they already knew that the odds were well and truly stacked against them, saving as many men as they could was still vitally important. In the belief that they'd only have 48 hours to complete the evacuation if the Germans continued at the same blistering pace, there was no time to be lost. Operation Dynamo was fast becoming a mission of blind faith, as the British military had no idea how many of their soldiers would be brought back or what to expect when they did arrive in France. Then a telephone call came through that really did change the course of history. It was a request from Vice Admiral Ramsay. "We may be able to do a much bigger thing at Dunkirk. Can you get every available craft round to me within 24 hours? And when the answer came in the affirmative, because of the civilian fleet already on standby, the desperate plight of the men stranded on the beaches of Dunkirk began to improve. The response was truly remarkable, and as the unlikely collection of vessels arrived at their destinations along the south coast of England, more incredible still was the speed at which this all happened, with everything kept top secret. Fishermen, tugboat skippers, and the yachting fraternity all reported for duty, to be given little more information except that the mission they'd volunteered for was likely to be dangerous, and after the allocation of tin hats, under the cover of darkness, they were sent on their way. This was to be an extremely treacherous journey for the private boat owners, and of course they had not had the benefit of any military training. Also, nobody had any idea what awaited them at journey's end, or how fiercely the Germans would attack them if they'd already taken Dunkirk by the time the boats got there. Yet the determination and fighting spirit of these brave civilians was immediately evident, as they all stood to be counted and play their part for king and country. There were a phenomenal 700 little ships of Dunkirk, as they came to be known, and although some would never return from this incredible journey, each boat owner was prepared to make the ultimate sacrifice, alongside the men awaiting rescue from Hitler's advancing army. On May the 26th, 1940, Operation Dynamo was officially launched, and as the huge fleet crossed the Channel, no one knew exactly what the next few days would bring. However, despite the fact that the rescue teams were preparing for the worst, expecting to see the beaches overrun with German troops slaughtering their countrymen, when they did get to the beaches of Dunkirk, Hitler's soldiers were nowhere to be seen. There was no logical explanation for this. If the Admiralty's calculations were correct, then at the rate the Nazis had been advancing by rights, the Allied servicemen now huddled on the beaches should have been all but wiped out. Something had happened to stop the Germans in their tracks. But rather than being a something, it was in point of fact a someone, and none other than Adolf Hitler himself. This was undoubtedly one occasion when fact certainly seems to have been stranger than fiction, because without Hitler's intervention, the BEF would undoubtedly have been decimated on those French beaches in 1940, before the fleet of rescue ships arrived. To this day, nobody is 100% sure why Hitler took this seemingly bizarre course of action, but he ordered the panzer divisions to halt 15 miles out of Dunkirk, and thus gave the Allies an inexplicable breathing space. Hitler's panzer divisions had been the key to the German campaign, and without them, the Nazis never would have advanced as far or at the speed they already had. Nevertheless, one school of thought is that because of the huge demand for tanks during the early months of the German campaign, they were desperately in need of attention. Many of the tanks either required maintenance or had already broken down during the tough months of fighting, and Hitler, believing he had the Allies so trapped he could deal with them at his leisure, may have thought this was a good time to make repairs. Also added into the equation is the fact that the coastal terrain around Dunkirk was thought to be unsuitable for the vehicles, and there may have been concerns that too many tanks would be lost, wiping out the BEF, who were, not to put too fine a point on it, sitting ducks. Hitler no doubt had his eye on the bigger picture, and he certainly would need all his tanks in good working order if he were going to conquer the remainder of France. And after all, even in his wildest dreams, he could never have imagined the rescue mission that was on its way. Equally, to date, every military decision Hitler had taken had been a complete success, so why should this be any different? He had Paris in his sights, and some have suggested that a mixture of arrogance and determination to destroy the City of Light fueled his command to stop the advance on Dunkirk. For Hitler, it would have made perfect sense to save his tanks to fight another day, and leave the stranded Allies for the Luftwaffe to finish off. To him, time simply was not an issue. There is another reason, however, that's been put forward as an explanation, which offers a very different perspective on these remarkable circumstances. Often, when we think of World War II, the Germans that actually opposed what Adolf Hitler was doing tend to be overlooked. The most famous, Klaus Schenk von Stauffenberg, attempted to assassinate Hitler in Operation Valkyrie on the 20th of July 1944. As a German officer with close access to Hitler, he set a bomb to go off in a meeting held in the Wolfschanze, one of the Führer's bases in Poland. As we all know, Hitler survived, but von Stauffenberg was far from being the first to disagree with Hitler's policies. Way back in 1940, a number of the career soldiers, now generals in the General Army, who'd fought proudly and with honour in the First World War, expressed their dissatisfaction at the way that Hitler was conducting the conflict. Consequently, as it's believed that his critics were involved in the advance on Dunkirk, it's been suggested that Hitler halted the proceedings in order to teach them a lesson. His directives were not to be questioned, and even if he chose to make the biggest military blunder of all time, it was within his power to do so. If this is true, then Hitler had totally misjudged the ease with which he could destroy the Allies stranded at Dunkirk, and if he was teaching his generals a lesson, it was one that would cost him dearly. With the German tanks turning their engines off and no longer advancing towards the Allies, the race to evacuate as many of the British and French troops from the beaches of Dunkirk was on, and a miracle of deliverance was now on the horizon. As the British vessel sailed ever closer to the French coast, the mass evacuation began as the troops waded deep out into the water to meet the rescue teams and clamber on board to safety. The fact that Hitler had called off his tanks just days earlier meant that the Allies were able to hold a 30-mile stretch of beach from which to await the rescue ships. Thousands upon thousands of men lined the shores and waited patiently for the ships to take them away. One of the most amazing aspects of this operation was, despite the utterly appalling conditions, everyone worked together to ensure the survival of as many of their fellow soldiers as possible. Orderly queues formed for the boats, and even though many knew that they would perhaps never make it off the beaches, they still waited their turn. Hundreds would sacrifice their lives so that others could live, with the order to fight till the last bullet willingly obeyed. For by this stage in the operation, Hitler had realised his mistake in calling off the attack, and had by now ordered a full-scale air and land assault to wipe out the troops as quickly as possible. The Allies were all too aware that some of their number would have to form a strong hold to keep Hitler's men away from the beaches in order to protect the rescue ships for as long as possible. Dunkirk by this stage was under heavy attack from the Germans, and the evacuation was getting tougher by the minute. Also, with many more than had been expected waiting for rescue, even with the additional 700 little ships, there was simply not enough boats. But having already achieved so much, the spirit of the rescuers was at an all-time high, and after the troops had safely disembarked on British soil, many of the boats simply went back again to France to rescue more men. At the start of the mission, the British government had hoped that they could save about 45,000 from the beaches. In the first 48 hours, even this seemed over-optimistic, as on the 26th and 27th of May, only 8,000 soldiers were able to make it off the French beaches alive. By the second day of the operation, Dunkirk was swathed in clouds of black smoke due to heavy shelling, but the fight was on. Despite the Germans' best efforts to take control, the Allied soldiers protecting the beaches dug in even deeper as they kept the Nazis at bay. Also, as news of what was happening reached Britain, additional boats joined the rescue mission to try and help, from more yachts and lifeboats to holiday steamers, with everyone trying to do their bit for the cause. No matter the size of the vessel, if it could sail across the Channel to France, then it was needed to save the lives of these brave men. The RAF were also playing their part, showing just what they were capable of as they fought long and hard to counter the relentless attacks staged by the Luftwaffe. The role of the British fighter pilots was crucial to the success of the mission, and while the enemy bombs kept falling from the skies as the German guns continued to fire, on the 28th of May, 19,000 soldiers were rescued from the beaches. Morale was now steadily rising amongst the Allied troops in France, and their chances of survival were also improving. Then just a day later, as the men coming back to Britain were counted in, the overall number of troops rescued had risen to 47,000. The Allies knew that the fates were being kind, and as the boats once again departed for France, they were certain that they would continue to bring back even more of their men alive. The weather was also proving to be cooperative, because as the operation reached its fourth day, a thick fog fell and shrouded the channel, making visibility for the Luftwaffe a real problem. Although this of course made it more difficult for the troops on the beaches to head out towards the boats, the fog did ensure that the ships remained hidden from view, while keeping many German attack planes grounded for the coming days. From what had been instigated as an almost impossible mission, which relied heavily on blind faith, it now looked as if Dunkirk would go down in the history books as one of the greatest ever military rescue missions. Regardless of the outcome of this particular battle, it would be the rescue that would be remembered rather than the battle and who the victor happened to be. As the evacuation drew to a close on the 4th of June, as the last boat left the shores of France, more than 330,000 men had been saved. Quite astonishingly, despite the odds being so heavily stacked in the Germans' favour, only 2,000 Allied servicemen were lost on the beaches of Dunkirk throughout the entire operation. This was an incredible achievement for the Allies and boosted the morale of the British dramatically. Everyone was doing their bit to help their fellow countrymen, and the famous Dunkirk spirit was spreading throughout the land. As the brave soldiers made it back home, the nation welcomed them as heroes. But it didn't end there. Having brought so many home safely, the next phase of the operation was equally demanding, relocating them from the south coast as quickly as possible, because this part of the country really couldn't handle such large numbers of soldiers for any great length of time. Train stations across the south quickly filled up with the soldiers hoping to get home and see their loved ones before being assigned to new duties. In fact, it would take weeks to achieve this, so in the meantime the people of Britain got to work in looking after the soldiers as best they could. Hundreds of volunteers worked around the clock to ensure that the soldiers were comfortable, while railway workers handed out postcards to the incoming men so they could write to their families to tell them that they'd made it out alive. The nation in its entirety wanted to show their gratitude to the brave men who'd survived to fight another day. But it was far from being all good news, because Hitler was now in control of mainland Europe, and Churchill knew it was essential that the people of Britain remained focused on the bigger picture. When he said, "Wars are not won by evacuations," he was serving notice that there was still a huge job to be done, and in Parliament he made a speech that summed up what was going to be required perfectly. "We shall go on to the end. We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." For as much of a miracle as the evacuation from the beaches of Dunkirk was, it was nonetheless a colossal military disaster. Churchill had saved the day, but the legacy of Chamberlain's indecisiveness and the superiority of the enemy troops had almost put Hitler in an unassailable position. Britain was now facing a very real threat of an invasion from Germany. There could be no more errors of judgment on the part of Churchill and the government. In truth, Hitler was winning the war. And now fighting alone as France fell, Great Britain could only hope that the English Channel would offer more protection than the Maginot Line had provided for the French. Hitler was wasting no time, and no sooner had the last Allied soldier got back to Britain than the German panzer divisions started to storm through France, conquering all in their path. For the people of France, many of whom had fought alongside the BEF as the battle for Dunkirk progressed, this was a disaster. It would be 4 long years before the Allies would return to liberate them from the German oppressors on the Normandy beaches for the D-Day landings. The jubilant Germans celebrated their victory, and when they marched into the beautiful city of Paris, Hitler had plans to completely destroy this jewel in the French crown and rebuild it to his Teutonic tastes. Fortunately for Paris, he changed his mind and focused his attention instead on rebuilding Berlin and left such treasures as the Arc de Triomphe intact. Once Paris was lost, an armistice was signed between Germany and the French Vichy government, which occupied a token area of France under the control of Marshal Pétain. Charles de Gaulle, the leader of the Free French, had no choice but to flee to Britain to continue the fight against Hitler from across the English Channel, while the growing French resistance did all they could to undermine the Nazi occupation. In the weeks and months that followed Dunkirk, the battle of wills between Adolf Hitler and Winston Churchill gained momentum. Some have suggested that Hitler actually let the Allies escape Dunkirk deliberately, wanting it to be viewed as a goodwill gesture, because he hoped to form a pact with Churchill rather than fight against him. However, if he honestly believed this a possibility, he was once again underestimating his opposition, something that would suit Churchill very well indeed. Ironically, before the evacuation of Dunkirk, the people on the home front in Britain were still in the mindset of the phony war. But with the newspapers filled with stories of great heroism, suddenly the nation was pulling proudly together, aware that something truly remarkable had happened. Also, with Chamberlain gone, and Churchill's rousing words after his first task as Prime Minister had been such a rousing success, morale was high amongst military personnel and civilians alike. There was a great belief that Britain could resist Hitler's advance, even though the odds were far from running in their favour. Interestingly, the pivotal role played by the RAF in the proceedings was not widely known, as the press coverage was kept to a minimum for reasons that were about to become all too evident. Nevertheless, Winston Churchill, who was well aware of what would be required of the Air Force in the coming months, made special mention of the fighter pilots in the House of Commons. There was a victory, Churchill claimed, inside this deliverance, which should be noted. It was gained by the Air Force. Many soldiers coming back have not seen the Air Force at work. They saw only the bombers, which escaped its protective attack. That Hitler was nonchalant about the RAF, perhaps unaware of their true potential as a result of the low-key reporting, was to prove very useful. Because once he'd completed his occupation of France, he did indeed begin his onslaught against the United Kingdom. If Dunkirk had touched every life in the entire nation, the war was now going to do the exact same thing, as the Battle of Britain began in the skies above southern England. Tactically, Hitler was well aware of the strength of the British Navy and knew that his smaller German equivalent was no match for Churchill's battleships, so long as the RAF were there for protection. But on paper at least, his Luftwaffe was much stronger than the RAF. So the first stage of his plan was to target the Air Force, believing that they would be destroyed in a matter of weeks, allowing for an invasion by sea before the winter set in. With fewer planes than the Luftwaffe and only about 800 pilots, it looked as if the RAF's days were numbered, just as Hitler hoped. But Dunkirk had done a great deal more than bring home over 330,000 men. The spirit and audacity that had snatched so many Allied servicemen, quite literally, from under Hitler's nose, came to the fore once more. Even so, the Battle of Britain is quite another story, and deserving of a great deal more time than left to us on this occasion. And of course, as we conclude this journey back in time to the beaches of Dunkirk, there's only one man who should be given the honour of having the last word. Churchill summed up perfectly what happened across the Channel on those fateful early summer days of 1940, when, even in defeat, the Allies prevented Adolf Hitler from winning the war. For Winston, Dunkirk was a miracle of deliverance, achieved by valour, perseverance, by perfect discipline and dauntless service, by resource, by skill, and by unconquerable fidelity. Offering hope, despite the troubled years that lay ahead, of a world that once again would be free of tyranny.